What separates Krunker from the rest of the games online, and what truly makes it one of the most unique games to ever be published, is the fact that basically every single guy's first experience of Krunker is exactly the same. It all starts when the teacher either leaves the class or is looking away, and some guy next to you tells you, in the mystical voice, hop on krunker.io. You look at him quizzically, but then you end up following through, and that's where the great saga of your life truly begins. The moment you and all of your classmates begin playing krunker.io. The most insane part about this experience that I just described is that nearly 200 million other guys, if not more, have had the same exact experience. So the question is, obviously, why? Well, it all started when two brothers named Vincent DeVry and Sidney DeVry, who were both Swiss-born but moved to Australia at a young age, decided that they wanted to make a high-paced shooter which would effectively become the CSGO for browser. Now, an even bigger reason or motivation behind making Krunker was because they saw a huge gap in the market. There was no shooter game which had blown up yet for browser, and the reason was very simple. None had even been made yet. Now, the two brothers already had experience making audio games. They were the developers of Vertex.io and a game which you'll probably recognize, Mumu.io. Making these two games not only taught them how to make audio games, but it also taught them how much money these audio games could bring in. They basically knew that if they rushed and were the first ones to publish the game, hundreds of thousands of dollars would come their way. So after deciding they wanted to make the game, they then decided to make a plan. The game was to be coded by Sidney DeVry, and it was to be designed, like everything you see in the game, the guns, skins, and maps, by his brother Vincent DeVry, who would now become the co-founder of the game. The base of the game would be Vertex.io, the game which I mentioned earlier. Vertex.io, for those who aren't aware, is basically the 2D version of Krunker. All the avatars in Krunker.io are based off of Vertex, and the two biggest game modes in Krunker, Free For All and Deathmatch, are also based off of Vertex. And basically the whole style of the game, the fonts, the layout of the menu, all of it is based off of Vertex.io. So when you look at the early days of Krunker, technically Vertex.io is the first ever version of Krunker. So after working for around half a year, since they were in a rush, Krunker was published on May 20th, 2018. Upon its release, the game only had the Triggerman, Hunter, and Running Gun. The rest of the characters were only added around half a year later in early 2019. As for the gameplay itself, it was a lot more relaxed back then. This was mainly because the tricks like bunny hopping hadn't been found yet, and because the game hadn't become big enough for it to be too competitive. And I mean, there were obviously some good players, but there was none of that annoying bullshit where some guy comes bunny hopping at you with a shotgun or weaving in between your bullets and fucking knifing you and making you feel bad about yourself. None of that. It was just a nice relaxed game where you killed others and they killed you. Now the next part of Krunker is obviously how it got popular. Now the way they got it popular was, firstly, on the first day of its release, Krunker got a few hundred plays. The reason was simply that many of those who played Vertex.io decided to try out Krunker.io, as they were getting very bored of Vertex.io and, you know, they wanted to try the 3D version of it. It's interesting. It's like trying out 4D chess when you've been playing it 3D your whole life. Now, a few weeks into the release of Krunker, those initial players of the first few days had started talking about Krunker in school, and so Krunker started spreading by word of mouth, like when I said in the introduction about the mystical guy. That is how the first mystical guy discovered Krunker.io. He played Vertex.io, he discovered on some forum that a 3D version of it had been made, and, well, he went on to tell you, and you told your friends, and every single school in the entire world, I'm not really even exaggerating here, ended up knowing what Krunker was. Now, by the end of 2018 or start of 2019, Krunker looked basically fully recognizable. It had reached a point where it was getting thousands of players daily, and players could now make maps and mods, and the game economy had by this point taken pretty good form, and was even worth a few million KR, or, you know, a few tens of thousands of dollars, which isn't a ton when you compare it to game economies like in CSGO or TF2, but it was still really good. The most expensive items in the game by this point were various rare skins like the contrabands and relics, which would commonly even be sold for upwards of hundreds of dollars. The economy would never reach the same level as the ones that you see in CSGO or TF2, which was mainly because Krunker had a lot more kids playing it compared to CSGO and TF2 having a lot more teenagers playing it, which obviously had a bit more money from working at, I don't know, McDonald's or whatever. Then it was throughout the year of 2019 that YouTube videos and the whole YouTube space of Krunker.io finally started to blow up, with some videos even reaching an upwards of 1 million views, which for the creator, if anyone's interested, got them them around $2,000 to $4,000 for making a krunker video. It's insane. Now, even though this was a very big amount, compared to other .io games like agar.io, which got 90 million views on its top video, which got like $200,000 for the creator, it obviously was very low compared to it. And the ratio of people who watched krunker compared to those who played krunker was very, very low. There are games like Happy Wheels where 15 times more people watched videos on it than played it, but for krunker, the opposite was the case, where 15 times more people played the game than actually ever even watched the YouTube video, or even considered watching a YouTube video on it. Now, the first reason why the YouTube space was so awful for krunker was that there was very few reasons to watch YouTube. Krunker was never serious enough for people to watch tutorials on it, and if you ever did, you're a nerd. And it wasn't, like, it's a fun game, sure, but it's only fun to play. It's something you play with friends when you're bored in class and the teacher isn't looking, but it's not something you, I don't know, search up the top 10 backstabs in krunker, or, oh wow, top 10 this and that. It's too boring for that. Only the playing was interesting. As for the money side of things, by the end of 2019, which was right before the pandemic, the game had earned over $1 million. This was basically because by this time, krunker was averaging over 15,000 players daily, which each one of those players saw tons of ads while playing, which was, from what I can remember, every time you died in krunker, you had to watch an ad to play it again. Now, each time an ad was viewed, the two brothers would earn something like half a cent, meaning that they obviously got a ton once they all stacked up. Now, because of the fact that krunker is mainly played in school, you would expect it to die off during the pandemic. But the weirdest part about krunker is that it was during the pandemic that it reached its peak of 30,000 unique players in a single day. This was a huge surprise to me and like my friend when I told him, because we both thought that krunker just completely died during the pandemic, since we heard nothing of it, and after the pandemic, at least in my school, nobody ever talked about it or played it or anything. It was also during the pandemic that another major thing would happen to krunker. It was released on Steam on February 1st, 2021. The motivation of the two brothers for adding krunker to Steam instead of keeping it a browser game was for a few reasons. Firstly, it would have better performance as a game that you download, instead of one which would constantly have to download stuff to you from a different server. The second reason for uploading it to Steam was all the free advertising that it brought with it. Basically, because of all the people that already played krunker, you know, the 30,000 people daily, when it was uploaded to Steam, a ton of people downloaded the game instantly, something like 2 million people. Now, because 2 million people downloaded the game in such a short span of time, the game quickly became the free game of the month and even the year, meaning that anyone who wasn't even familiar with krunker, someone who never even heard of krunker, and like, I don't know, let's say Poland, maybe people in Poland didn't know what krunker was. All of those people who had never heard about krunker before but did know about Steam, which is like, you know, a very large amount compared to krunker. All of those people now found out about krunker because they would go on the free games menu and they would see it at the very, very top, meaning that even more people would download it, which gave krunker a whole new fan base. And the last reason why people added the game to Steam is that people are way more likely to spend money on a game that they have downloaded as opposed to one that they just search up, since when they download a game, it makes it seem more premium and permanent. And you probably have the same thing where you've spent more money on games which you have downloaded than games that you just search up. I mean, I don't know if anyone, except me, to be honest, I'll shamefully admit, who has spent money on agar.io. But I know tons of people who have spent money on, I mean, let's say Overwatch. I have one friend who has a bit too many hours on the game. Now, as I mentioned earlier, krunker had reached its peak in early 2020. And this may seem like a very good thing, you know, to reach the peak of your popularity. But this was also technically a very bad thing, since it meant that everything was downhill from here. Because everything was downhill, it ended up being very hard for the two brothers to find any motivation to even work on the game, especially since they had other projects which, you know, they wished to work on. This was why on May 13th, 2022, the two brothers decided to sell krunker.io along with their whole company, which owned games like Moomoo.io, to FRVR. They sold the game for something between $40 million and $76 million. Now, the projects that the two brothers wanted to work on weren't actually for more video games. The two brothers ended up using the $40 to $76 million very wisely, and the projects that they ended up investing in were real estate. They became real estate guys, and it wasn't like they failed at all. They ended up making over $100 million as real estate guys, which, I mean, $1/10 billion, which technically all came from krunker and Moomoo.io. So the fact that you could even make that much money from making a video game and then making money and then spending that money wisely. So the next question is, what happened to krunker during these past 2 years under FRVR's dictatorial autocratic rule? Well, firstly, they added the battle pass system, which is basically exactly what EA would have done if it took over ownership of Krunker. And in the battle pass, you could get a ton of useless skins, which I don't think you could even sell for that much. But more importantly, you can get KR and junk. Now, junk in the game was clearly heavily inspired by TF2's crafting system, where you can craft scrap metal into reclaimed metal, and reclaimed metal into refined metal, and the refined metal you can finally craft into weapons. In Krunker, it's a bit less annoying of a system, and the junk can directly be crafted into cosmetic items. Other than that, basically all they did was make the game more corporate. They did that by placing heavier restrictions on what you can say and what you cannot say in the chat. Since all of these restrictions were put in place by FRVR, the player count has fallen to around 85 people per day, with the peak in the last 30 days, the last month, being only 97, less than 100.